You're listening to Online Pet Health Podcasts with Dr. Megan Kelly. Continuing education for veterinarian rehabilitation therapists. Learn more at onlinepethealth.com.
Hey vet rehabbers, here's a question for you. Is passive stretching impacting the fascia or the muscle? Today, we look at another one of our research refreshes, and this time looking at a narrative review of fascial or muscle stretching. So we've got loads of questions. Is fascia the major limiting factor in static stretching? The aim of the review is to look at the differences and similarities between muscle, tendon, and fascia, and looking at the three mechanical behaviors to better understand their integrative action when stretch is applied. Before we head over to this research review, if you're not an Online Pet Health paid member, you've got a few weeks before we update the webinars in our free membership. So there are currently muscle activation in cruciate disease by Carrie Adrian, equine introduction to neonatal physiotherapy by Hedy Hayatinen, and the clinical management of forelimb lameness by Amy Kings. So if you're interested, the Online Pet Health membership, we now have 200 hours of small animal specific lectures, 100 hours of hydro specific content, and 134 hours in our equine membership. You can access them by signing up at onlinepethealth.com/free. And if you want more information about the membership, head over to onlinepethealth.com. Okay, so let's learn some more about stretching.
Good morning, guys. So today we are going to be looking at a human research article that published earlier this year in the Journal of Applied Science. And some of the researchers include the Steco family, so some really big influences within the fascial world. And what they looked at is a narrative review of the literature and trying to figure out if passive stretching is impacting the fascia or the muscle. So the purpose of the manuscript is to evaluate the mechanical behavior of muscle, tendon, and fascia to better understand how they interact during passive stretching. The stress-strain values suggest that fascia is the first tissue to limit elongation, suggesting it is the major target in static stretching exercises. The maximum range of motion may be limited by non-muscular structures such as fascia. If we look at some of the research, unilateral stretching targeting one lower limb was found to increase the range of motion of the contralateral limb. An acute bout of stretching of the lower limbs was found to increase the maximum range of motion of the distal upper limbs and vice versa. Acute bouts of stretching of the lower limbs induced an increased range of motion of the cervical spine, and then a significant correlation between the pelvic anteversion or forward tilt in a long sitting position with the knees fully extended and the displacement of the deep fascia of the gastrocnemius medialis. So what all of these articles or findings have in common is that they show that when we are stretching one area, when we are targeting one area, one muscle group or joint, we end up having an effect in a distal part of the body or in a distant part of the body. And this makes us think immediately, well, what tissue am I affecting? Is it the fascia? So I'm not going into, with this article, I'm not going to dive into all the information they give us about the fascia. If you want to go further into specifically fascia, we have a few webinars in our members portals. Search for Larry Davies, Michelle Broadhurst, and on the equine side, Tulia Luamala, that was a brilliant series, and Marta Kulikowska, that's also one I really recommend. Alright, so the aim of this article is to review the differences and similarities between muscle, tendon, and aponeurotic fascia in the mechanical behaviors and thixotropic effect in order to better understand their integrative action when stretch is applied. Right, so they focused on research, they focused on static stretching and its mechanism of action, comparing the mechanical properties of the tissues involved. They included studies that looked at the stress-strain curve, stress-relaxation curve, thixotropic effect on muscle, tendon, and fascia. If thixotropic is a new word to you, I will go into that just now. Results. Right, so So the stress-strain curve. So just briefly, the stress-strain curve represents the applied force per area, while strain expresses the percentage of elongation beyond the resting length. In a stress relaxation test, a predefined tensile strain is applied and corresponding stress is followed by a function of time. All biphasic and viscoelastic soft tissues exhibit first the relaxation phase, and then the entire load is carried by the solid matrix of a tissue. So in the toe region of our stress-strain curve, the stress-strain relationship is non-linear, with the slope increasing with increased load as collagen fibrils straighten out. In the elastic region, stress and strain are linearly related, and the slope of the curve is called Young's modulus. In the plastic region, the yield point is reached where tissue starts to undergo permanent deformation, or microfractures within the collagen network, the collagen fibril network. And then the failure point is the sudden failure of a tissue occurring, and then the stress vanishes. All right. In the aponeurotic fascia, there is data for the plantar fascia and the crural fascia. Stress-strain is non-linear, with the initial portion of the curve showing high deformation, low force characteristics. In the muscle, the presence of the aponeurosis and epimysium play a role in the mechanical failure. The failure region of the muscle is about 75% of the elongation in the direction of the fibers, with variation in this number according to the type of muscle and whether or not they tested it with the aponeurosis and epimysium in place. The stress-strain response is sensitive to the stretching velocity, and that's quite important for us clinically. In the tendon, the linear region begins at nearly 2% of the strain for most tendons. So our elastic region starts at 2%. Then microscopic tearing, or the plastic region, can start at 4% of the original length of the tendon. The stress-strain pattern is not uniform along the length of a tendon, with some areas being stress-shielded. So that's also really interesting. So this is the little graph that they shared, and the red is the stress-strain curve for muscle in comparison to fascia and then tendon. And so, when we compare the stress-strain curve of a muscle to tendon and to fascia, it doesn't even feature on the graph. But we can see that, a tendon stress-strain curve is very steep, very quick, whereas fascia is a little bit longer and a little bit more sloped. And yes, right, so the table here shows us the highest stress that each tissue can tolerate with their corresponding strain. If we then look at the stress relaxation curve, this really represents the viscoelastic property of a tissue. There's a time-dependent decrease in the stress when a tissue is under a constant strain. Stress can be reduced by 35 to 40% in 120 seconds without dependency on the level of strain applied. In a tendon, the rate of stress relaxation has been shown to increase with increasing strain. Tendons also show more viscoelastic behavior at higher strains and more elastic behavior at lower strains. Now, the thixotropic effect. If you had never heard of this before, neither had I. So basically, it is the property of a substance to decrease its viscosity when shaken or stirred, and then solidify when left to stand. Muscle, so they're going to bring this to each of our tissues again. So muscle has been demonstrated to have these properties due to the formation of weak actin-myosin cross bridges in resting muscles. When the muscle is elongated, the actin-myosin overlap decreases with decreasing binding sites, and the greatest number of binding sites is available at an intermittent length of the muscle. In a tendon, there are many factors that can change the viscoelastic properties of the extracellular matrix, affecting force transmission and tissue structure maintenance, such as the age of the horse, or temperature, or pH. When we look at fascial thixotropy, This is related mostly to the presence of hyaluronic acid. As the viscoelastic coefficient of hyaluronic acid is not constant, with viscosity decreasing under loading conditions and increasing under resting conditions, within the fascia, if the hyaluronic acid assumes a more packed conformation, it increases the density of the loose connective tissue inside the fascia, compromising the structure. So hyaluronic acid viscosity will also change with temperature changes as well as with pH changes. It has been demonstrated that after strenuous exercise in the muscle compartment, the pH can reach a value of 6.6 due to lactate accumulation. That means an increase of approximately 20% in hyaluronic acid viscosity with a consequent sensation of stiffness. All right, so it makes sense to me, this thixotropic effect when we take it to the hyaluronic acid and the fascia, and how it impacts the viscosity of that tissue and its ability to move and stretch. So, deep fascia, when we think about the stress strain and the stress relaxation curves, deep fascia more closely matches the range of excursion that static stretching exercises generate. So if we consider that a tendon can only stretch 4% of its length and a muscle can stretch up to 75% of its length, consider the amount of range gained from a passive stretch. Okay, it's not 4% and it's not 75%, it's somewhere in the middle. All three tissues have viscoelastic properties and will reduce tension over time when stretched to a constant length during static stretching. The presence of hyaluronic acid in the fascia likely forms part of why immobility reduces fascial gliding and range of motion. The results suggest that static stretching can induce an increase in the overall stretch tolerance in the muscle, tendon, and fascia of the anatomical region. Considering the stress-strain curves, we may consider fascia to be the limiting factor in a stretch or in range of motion, and therefore we need to take care of the elements that can modify the fascial viscoelastic properties to improve stretching efficiency. It also means that we can use the fascial lines and the fascial layers and patterns to impact distant regions of the body if we understand where they run and how they work. So I really, they put this little illustration in, and when I saw it, I was like, what? Electricity? But it's really cool. It's really a nice demonstration of kind of, if we're going to stretch this entire unit, okay, our muscle can increase by 54 to 75%. Our tendon, which is attaching our muscle, only has about 4% stretch in it. But overall, this is quite a lot of stretch, okay? And if the deep fascia can only elongate 27%, then this deep fascia is going to be the limiting factor when we are lengthening these 2 points or stretching these 2 points away from each other. So I thought this was a really cool illustrational way of thinking about what our tissue is looking like, or being put, how it's put together and how it's going to impact on each other, the different tissues impacting on each other. And it's obviously not quite this, it's not this straightforward. The body is very interconnected, but it is a good illustration nonetheless. So I'd love to hear from you guys what your thoughts are. But essentially the limitations in the study that they reported are that they only included static stretching in the research articles that they evaluated, and I think that, from my perspective as an animal rehabilitation therapist or an animal physiotherapist, this is an advantage because I'm primarily using static stretching. So it kind of throws my clinical relevance out when they're including dynamic stretching or other forms of stretching into research like this. So I'm happy with just static stretching. But they did only look at the biomechanical effects and not the neurological effects, both on the peripheral and the central nervous systems. And that is certainly a disadvantage, but I always like to think that we need to try and take the body apart a little bit to understand each individual component before we put it back together and understand the whole. And so when we're looking at the body as a whole and trying to treat holistically and work holistically with the entire body, that is always our end goal. But if we do not understand the individual components that make up that body and how they work individually and interconnectedly, then it makes it difficult for us to really be specific and effective. So their conclusion is that they support the role of non-muscular structures such as fascia in flexibility, perception of stretch, and limitation of the maximal range of motion. The knowledge of the mechanical properties of the human fascia could permit a rational explanation of possible response modification of these tissues to various types of stretching. During stretching, the bulk of the mechanical work is done on the aponeurotic fascia. That is the first one that is stretched when the muscles are not in isometric contraction. Only secondarily, muscle and tendon are involved. Without understanding myofascial force transmission, we will never be able to understand muscular function completely and to design a correct plan of stretching for the patient and for healthy people, animals, all of the above. So I would definitely recommend, if you have not yet, if you have access to the Equine portal, go and watch Marta Kulikowska's webinar on fascinating fascia, because she goes really into the histology of it, and so that we understand the fascia from a cellular perspective. And then Tulia Luamala did a 4-part series on the fascia, where she really looked at all the different components, because fascia includes dense connective tissue, loose connective tissue, so many different kinds of tissue. So to just kind of say fascia feels very non-specific. So go and watch that if you have access to it. Otherwise, Larry Davies' webinar and Michelle Broadhurst's webinars on the fascia, those will all add value and add understanding to your toolbox. Okay, and with that, I can say thank you to the people involved in this research who brought this together. I look forward to some more specific research answering this question. So instead of a narrative review, let's actually look at which tissues are being stretched and how, and what exactly the stress strain curve for different types of fascia looks like. And with that, I will leave you guys, and thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit the subscribe button so you get notified every time I load a new podcast. I'm here every week talking to vet rehab therapists from all over the world about all things vet rehab. Don't forget to bookmark the next Vet Rehab Summit on Saturday, the 4th of November. Come and be a part of the world's largest online veterinary rehabilitation conference created specifically for you, the vet rehabber community. Onlinepethealth members get VIP complimentary access to the Vet Rehab Summit. For more information about continuing education for vet rehabbers, you can go to onlinepethealth.com.